I am Michael Crawford. I am going to be moderating this awesome, wonderful, super exciting panel. And because standing at this lectern makes me feel a little bit like Beyonce, I'm actually going to transfer to the seat there momentarily. But I just want to just set a little bit of context here. So we really want to focus on what are the challenges and especially the opportunities around narrative change as it relates to alternative response, right? We just heard Sarah talk about a lot of great polling information and unexpected support that is growing, and obviously we want that support to continue to grow. And so we're going to talk with this illustrious panel about some ways that we can do that. Talk to them before. They are all really wonderful. So I'm going to transfer to a seat, and we're going to get moving. All right, can you all hear me? Okay, you're gonna notice me looking down at my phone every now and then. That's not because I'm on Instagram. It's because my phone is where I have the questions for the panelists. And to the panelists, super excited to see you all in person. So I do wanna say, I have some questions for you. We talked about those before, but I think probably the most interesting thing might come from conversation amongst you. So feel free to chop it up. And then, of course, we're going to make sure that we have ample time for questions from all of you awesome people in the audience. Okay, so my first question, Sarah. You just did a great presentation.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so you said that programs are more popular among voters across party lines than some may expect, which is wonderful to hear. What are the key things driving that unexpected support, and what concrete messaging should advocates use to grow support among persuadable audiences?
Thank you so much for that question. I really think the reason that these programs are so popular across party lines is because they're effective, and there's been great media coverage, particularly in the last year, about individual success stories like the video we just saw. I think the human stories that people are hearing and they're making it out through the media and I think through word of mouth, they're really, really persuasive. And so it's just been, I think it's been a banner year for these stories to really make it out. And I think that's what's driving the increase in support, is that people are hearing about it. And as far as how do we talk about it to make sure that support continues to grow, I think the police can't do it alone frame is what we've tested and what we believe across party lines is really very popular and expands that popularity.
Great, thank you for that. And now I have a question for all of you, and you can fight for who gets to answer it first, but fight in an alternative response friendly kind of way. Okay, so I have a question about the phrases we use to describe the work. So far we've been talking about it in terms of alternative response. Should we be using alternative response? Does that imply it's an experimental alternative rather than a proven solutions? What term do you choose and why?
So this has been the topic that we have talked about so much already in the conference. The first night I was here, we spent, there were about 20 people in the room, and the whole dinner debate was, is alternative response the right word? I think that the alternative response has probably served us well early on in the field, because I think it was born out of a response to an alternative to police, but I think we're getting to a place where we're going to outgrow it, and we have to find a new word for the reasons that you named. And I think in Durham, we don't talk about it as alternative response anymore. I think increasingly I talk a lot about we're building a new branch of public safety, a new department. But I don't know what the word is. We'll see maybe in 2 years. I'm curious from others.
So I'm a journalist. I work for the Marshall Project, and I need 7 words that I can rotate through in a 1,500 word story without being redundant, which I'm sure is really annoying to a lot of you. So I just try and be really specific with readers about what we mean when we use these terms, like who's dispatching them, who's going, what kind of calls are they going to try and drill down on the specifics.
Thank you.
Well, I think many times we use the phrase crisis response, but it's not always a crisis. Sometimes it's just a situation. So, in Safer Cities, we often use the phrase modern public safety infrastructure. I know it's a little bit clunky, but I think it gets at the idea that we're modernizing something and building up something that should be really fully built out so the cities can really be safe.
I guess in my mind, the thing we did some real. My name is Dan Gorenstein. Did some deep dive with the Health Policy News Organization Trade-Offs. We did a deep dive on Ryan's program here, HEART, and we did a lot of reporting, hours and hours and hours. And it was an interview that I did with Ryan that really sort of crystallized for me what this was all about. When Ryan said, if somebody's robbing a bank, you call the police. If there's a fire, you call fire. If somebody's having a heart attack, you call EMS. What about for all the other calls? And I was just like, holy shit, this is a real thing. I get it now. And like I'd been struggling to kind of like get it, but when he said that, it snapped for me. And I think it's this idea of how do you construct, how you really sort of define this, and as this kind of co-equal first responder, I think that for us, and that idea, that is, we named the series the fifth branch, because it was the fifth branch of the responders, 911 being the fourth. And so I think however you frame it, I think it's moving in that type of direction is essential for this to grow.
Great, thank you all. So I was remiss and didn't really introduce myself or the panel, but I'm going to do that as we answer the questions. And one of the things I should have said about myself is that I also worked for a long time in the marriage equality movement, which will be celebrating 10 years actually this month. And also this, thank you. Also this month is Pride Month. So if there are any queer people in the room, happy Pride. The reason I mention my work in the marriage movement is at a certain point we had a similar kind of conversation around how do we shift the narrative, build support among persuadable audiences for marriage. And one of the things that you were saying, Ryan, you were talking about the evolution in the words that are being used. And, it made me think back to there was a point when we were talking about it in terms of gay marriage, then it shifted to marriage equality, then it shifted to marriage and the freedom to marry. I happen to work for an organization called Freedom to Marry, so of course we love that term. And so, one thing to think about is the language that we use now may not be the language that we're using in 5 years, and that a way to think about it is what is going to most resonate with the people and to continue to build the support that Sarah talked about earlier, so that we get this mass movement of people who are supporting the programming, calling for the programming, calling for funding for the additional programming so that it expands, grows, and becomes institutionalized. So Ryan Smith. Hi, Ryan. So my next question is going to be for you. And Ryan is the director of the Durham Community Safety Department, which is doing awesomely fantastic work. So Ryan, you and the folks in Durham, you've been doing really interesting and impactful work. Can you tell us briefly about the podcast project that you worked on with Dan Gorenstein, who I'll introduce in a second, and why you thought it was important to tell the story of your work?
Yeah. For the practitioners out there, you can imagine we got probably an email at first from the producer at Trade-Offs, from someone on Dan's team, and they were interested. They were trying to find a city that would be really open and let them do really in-depth storytelling and journalism. And when we get those, part of my reaction is not, my internal reaction is that sounds scary. Because you're building something, it's in its early stages, you know all the things that are working well, and you all know the things that are not working well. And inviting a journalist into that space can feel a little scary, but I've tried to develop discipline of not just saying no and being curious and learning more. And so we ended up following up with Ryan and Dan and learning more about what kind of story they were trying to tell, the kind of how in-depth it would be, what type of access they wanted. And the reason that I think there's two big reasons why we try to say yes to those if we feel that there's real journalistic integrity, that it's going to be a long-form type of journalism that will tell the fullness of the story as best it can. And those two reasons are, As y'all know, because you heard about our dashboard, we like data. We like trying to collect and tell data about our work. We think that's one important piece of transparency. But underneath those numbers are stories. And those stories can be hard to tell. We might lack the bandwidth to tell those stories well ourselves. And so if someone's willing to come in and help us tell our story well, I think that's really important because it helps the people in our community better understand and see the work in ways that they just can't see and understand, and the numbers that are also really important. The second reason, and this is one that we really, these are both important. One thing I became convinced of early on is we wait too long to tell stories. And so, when I think about, I've been the director of the department since it started, and this was the second opportunity. We had a documentary crew that wanted to come in, and we ended up doing that. A short documentary was created even earlier in our first 6 months. And that was really scary for me. I was worried, but ultimately I also believed in what we were doing. I believed in the people that were doing the work. And I had the trust that if we let someone come in and tell that story with a fullness, that full human story that would emerge would be a good story and a story worth telling. And I also became convinced that we all have a responsibility in these early stages to brave those waters a little bit, because if we wait 10 years and someone comes and tells the story of my program or your program in 10 years, for other communities that are thinking about doing that work, it's going to be harder to understand what was the first step, what were the first 6 months like, what was that first year. And so part of it for me is feeling like we owe it to an emerging field to try to let people see what it looks like in the beginning, so that it can help other people understand what that step looks like, maybe be less afraid of it, and take that step with us.
Great, thank you. And I think that on that last point that you were making, telling the story sooner rather than later also provides an opportunity to inspire people to do similar things in their communities. And that's a way that we help the growth of alternative response programs across the country, and how we help to begin to shift the narratives. So Dan.
Yes.
Dan is the founder and executive director of Trade-Offs. Ryan just talked a little bit about the podcast project that you all worked on together. And so my next question is for you. And it's kind of similar to the question that I asked Ryan. As a journalist, what caught your eye about Durham's work in that it made you think it was important to tell the story through an in-depth podcast episodes versus like a singular episode? And how did you build the relationships and trust needed to tell the story?
Well, we felt the moment, right? The post George Floyd moment, that there was a sense of momentum in our country to field alternative crisis response. And we were really excited to, just as Ryan was talking about, kind of get in on the ground floor. We knew very much we wanted to create content that was going to be useful to other communities that were, alternative crisis response curious. And so we went to a number of communities, but we talked with Ryan. This is sort of how you got to building the trust. We went to Ryan and said, look, this is our vision. This is what we want to do. But if we're going to actually really be able to create content that is useful and meaningful to like people in this room and similar rooms, then you need to be able to have all the access. You need to be in the vans. You need to be interviewing the chief of police. You need to be interviewing Ryan again and again and again. The word we used was embed. How did we build this trust? How did Ryan, it took a lot to actually like build this trust, but that all happened before the microphone went on. We built the trust by having off the record conversations, no bullshit conversations about like, this is our agenda, this is what we want, this is what we need. And actually it was like, I wouldn't say we were haggling, but it was a negotiation. And I think that's really an important thing for the press as well as for you all to think about, like, how can we negotiate before anything's on the record? How can you begin to negotiate? Because it's in that space, it's in that time when you can really build that trust.
And I think your point, Dan, about it being kind of a negotiation, and you used the word haggling at one point as well, discussion to build the trust, to build the relationship, giving Dan and his colleagues an opportunity, Ryan and his colleagues an opportunity to lay out their concerns, be honest about, what was the things that were important to them. What were some of the ways that you focused on hearing what they were actually trying to say in ways that may have helped you to tell a better story, or in ways that helped to make them feel more comfortable engaging in this project with you?
Thanks. What a thoughtful question. I really appreciate it. I think what we try to do in general, but certainly in Durham as well, is there's a little bit of a formula to a lot of our work, which is sort of like, what's the problem? What's the proposed solution? And what are the pros and cons of the proposed solution, right? What are the trade-offs, which is the name of our organization. And that's how we approached Ryan. We said, this is what we want to do. And that was the framework. And we were looking for our partner in this, in terms of Durham. We wanted a partner who was willing to be honest with us, particularly about that last part, right? Defining the problem is pretty easy. Most people will agree on the problem. Defining and discussing, profiling the solution, that's pretty easy. That's the program. But the magic is in the honest conversation of grappling with the pros and cons. And so we made that very clear to Ryan and his team in Durham that we needed that. And, frankly, they were so receptive to that, and they just told us. So we just listen. The act of doing an interview is listening. And so we told them we want to have an honest conversation about this, and they had an honest conversation with us about the challenges that they had. So we understood deeply what was going on for them.
Great, thank you. So Christy, hi. So Christy Thompson is a staff writer at the Marshall Project. And so as a journalist, what challenges have you faced trying to tell the story about the movement for alternative solution? Has it been challenging getting advocates to open up to you and trust you and trust that you're not out to tell a negative story about their work?
Yeah, I think a lot of it goes back to what Dan just talked about with trade-offs, which is, especially with smaller programs, smaller than Durham, there's so many people working so hard with so many different agencies to make sure that these programs succeed and that they keep getting funding. And I think that makes it really difficult and vulnerable for people to be honest about what's holding them back and what the challenges are. And as a journalist, I really need to be able to tell that story as well as all of the ways that it's succeeding. And as Ryan mentioned, that's valuable not just for the readers, but for the organization itself and for other places that are trying to model these programs to know, okay, what are the roadblocks that I might encounter? What could come up? But you go into a city and it's really hard for someone to be honest with you about, yeah, I wish I could be going to these kinds of calls, but the police department won't let me, or the fire department's getting in my way, or the mayor's office is being really difficult with approving our funding. So I think that's a big challenge and a deeply understandable one. And so I think I really encourage people before working with a journalist to vet that journalist, read their work, understand that you trust the good, honest reporting that they're doing and know the news outlet that they work for, so that you get a sense that someone's going to address something straight on and not be looking for a specific angle or story to tell. One other challenge that I'm curious Ryan's experience with this is source exhaustion. People talked about this yesterday, like the added burden and labor of being researched and studied and all of those communications you have with researchers. We are the same. We are very annoying. We'll ask you a lot of questions that you don't know why we're asking. We'll probably come back to you 1,000 times. And you are all already doing so much with so little, especially your folks who are on the ground. And so asking them to take all of this time to explain to me what they're doing, I know is a huge ask. So I try and be really thoughtful about that. I did a national story that ran with the Trade-Offs podcast, and I really wanted to go down and do ride-alongs with Durham because I find that reporting really valuable and exciting, and I wanted to be there, but I realized that at that point, these folks had already been followed for so many hours that I needed to just let them do their job, and it would have been more for me than for them. So that's the thing I try and be thoughtful about.
And just to put a point on that, I mean, I think we had over 100 hours of tape. You know, I mean, we spent.
Sounds right.
Yeah.
Is it just 100?
Just one, yeah.
It may have been 200. You know, I mean, it was a huge lift for you and your team. You know, you really had to sacrifice to be able to do this. But I will say, you know, and thanks so much for bringing that up. I mean, there was one teacher in Durham, North Carolina, I think a 4th grade teacher in a public elementary school, after the series ran, that adopted, you know, figured out a way to do some curriculum around the series. And so you've got 4th graders in this community after the fact now thinking about alternative crisis response, right? Like, thank you. That's a big ass deal. It really is. I'm just trying to get this crowd going. It's early, and you know, I'm just kind of, let's go, people.
Start them young, you know.
So Ryan, any comment on source?
Yeah, source exhaustion is a real thing. You know, as I mentioned, when Trade-Offs reached out, we hadn't been that long. I'll look at Lee, that we had a documentary crew that Arnold Ventures had funded out of RTI that ended up creating this 30-minute documentary. So that gave us probably the longest pause in agreeing to do the podcast. But I will say I'm really grateful that we did. If you haven't listened to The Fifth Branch, it's great journalism, and I say that not because it's about my program, but because I think it's some of the best journalism out there on alternative response over the 3 episodes, and I'm really grateful that it exists. So for us, I mean, I think after that, we're like, yeah, we're going to take a break for a while. And there's other places that journalists can go and help tell that story. But I think a key part in managing source burnout is we talked to everyone in our department about why we were doing this. And we also had open space, like what's important to us in doing this? You know, what are the boundaries that we want to set when we think about the neighbors that we are serving and who we're caring for? And those boundaries that we understood together as a team, and we would talk about as part of the haggling and negotiations of those lines. But I think for everyone to understand why we're doing this, we're not doing this because we're like trying to. Sorry, I just can't complete that sentence. But I think we tried for people to understand the mission and how this connected to our work and how this was about helping people understand our work, and also helping support a broader movement by telling stories early in the process. And I think for people to feel connected and understand why there were going to be journalists riding around, we also gave people the option. Not everyone feels comfortable in that space. And so for the teams who were open to that, then that was an option for them. So there's a lot of things I think you're doing in managing that process among staff that were important for us.
Can I say one quick thing? I also just want folks to know that the Trade-Offs Project was incredible, but there can be really great reporting about these programs that is much less in depth. And it doesn't have to be shallow, right? Like
Really? Sure.
reporters can do really thoughtful, deep, nuanced stories in a week, as long as you trust that reporter and know that they're getting their facts straight. So this was a beautiful gift of access and a really deep project, but it doesn't always have to be that way.
And I just want to say thank you, Christy, for assuaging any fears in the audience that it may take up 100 plus hours to get a really good story. And so Sarah Youssef, who kicked us off this morning, of course, is project director at Safer Cities Research. And the research, again, was really, really interesting. So your research found that the alternative solutions are more popular than we realize. And I'm wondering, and probably some folks in the room are wondering as well, how can advocates use the data from your research to complement their work to more effectively build support for alternative solutions when they're talking to community members and policymakers?
Well, I think what's really interesting is that really with each of the arguments that we gave in support of these alternative programs, support is still very, very high. So it does depend on your audience. I think really understanding who is in your audience. Like I noticed in that in the video we saw that it really was about meeting people's needs. And that isn't the number one most persuasive frame that we found across party lines, but it also depends on who your audience is. And it's still very, very popular when you're using those kinds of concepts. And of course, the individual stories, you can't really test on them, but we know that they're what move hearts and minds. And so I think definitely make sure that the stories are getting to people. Make sure you tell those stories early and often. But also, I think spend a little bit of time thinking about who's in your audience and what they might be responsive to, and creating a number of different frames that you might choose from, and spending a little bit of time considering which frame will be most persuasive to which audience, and understanding that they're all really great reasons, and we're not able to move support massively. We're talking about really the movement was around 4 points. That being said, if you can get those 4 points, you want to get those 4 points, right?
Yeah. Can I ask a follow-up to this?
Please.
So in communities telling their stories, right? And you've got the anecdotes and the value of the anecdotes. What about data? Have you all learned about, are there certain metrics that are important and help sort of propel things forward?
Yeah.
And if so, what are the metrics?
That is an awesome question. And I think what we found is that police capacity argument is the most persuasive across party lines. And the metric that helps to build that is how many calls are diverted. And so we're seeing that in the headlines all the time. We just saw some great ones about the Oakland Macro program. All of these programs diverting a percentage or a number of calls, and how many are able to be resolved with some of them are resolved with de-escalation by phone when the mental health counselors are in the dispatch center. And so what does that do for capacity? What does that do for budgets? I think that metric is really powerful, and it's powerful no matter who you are, because you want your systems, if you live in a city, you want your systems to be efficient.
And that's why that data point so persuasive, is because it suggests like the efficiencies that can be realized.
I think so. I can't really test the reason exactly, so I don't know precisely, but that makes sense to me.
Great, thank you. And then those of you in the audience, your time is coming soon. So I have about 10 minutes more, actually about 7 minutes more questions for the panel. Then we want to hear from you. So this is your like Beyonce grab the mic, Blue Ivy, dancing on stage, showing up her mom kind of moment. So if you have questions that are percolating in your head, please start to formulate them now. Okay, so I'm going to switch the order of questions a little bit just to keep you on your toes. It's because one of the most important questions that I think we're here to talk about today is, there's growing support, right? Like we've talked about it in terms of the program that you're leading, Ryan. We talked about it in the research that you're doing. We talked about it in the great podcast episodes that you've done in partnership with Ryan, over 100 plus hours of footage. And we talked about it with your work as well. And one of the things that you mentioned when we were having our background conversations was that anything on this issue, when you post it, your readers really respond. So there's growing support. So what do we need to do? What do we need to do to figure out in terms of narrative over the next 5 years to continue growing that public support so that it becomes common wisdom, common knowledge, common sense in a way, so that programs like Ryan's and all the programs that the awesome folks in the audience are running are not scrounging for money, but they're getting everything, all the resources that they need to run impactfully.
I think a lot of it has to do with buy-in from the police chiefs. I mean, many of these programs get vocal support from the leaders of the police departments who don't want these kinds of calls. That's not why they went to police academy. And so I think that making sure that piece is present, where it's possible is just incredibly persuasive.
So, for Durham, that's certainly been true. And we have a fantastic police chief who, if you've listened to the Fifth Branch, you hear a lot from Patrice Andrews. And I think that was intentional. Like when your team approached about who you should talk to, one of the persons I thought should be part of that story was the police chief, because I knew that she believed in this work I knew that she would talk about the importance of it, and I think that that is one important audience in this, that we have worked really hard to develop that. It didn't just happen by accident, but I think her leadership in that space, her talking about it, if you haven't listened to it, some of the amazing journalism how vulnerable she is and talking about her own experience as a law enforcement officer, and that is also really compelling in its own way. But I just want to underscore that. And then a data point, one thing I just wanted to say, when you talked about police capacity, that also resonated. I think one of the things that we consistently report on is how many hours we're saving law enforcement and freeing them up. It works well. Like this year, I think it's over 8,000 hours that we have freed up from law enforcement not having to go on calls, that they can be available for other calls where they're needed. So just to underscore locally, I think that has worked well for us too.
Some of the stories that actually to go back what you said about how these stories resonate with our readers, this is just anecdotal. It's not the depth of data that you have here, but I first wrote about these programs back in 2020 when I followed around the Olympia team, and it's 5 years later. Every now and again, that story will surface on social media, and it always drives so much engagement. Like, folks seem to be endlessly interested in this. And more broadly, at the Marshall Project, we do a lot of deep dive reporting about the problems in the justice system, and we hear a lot from our readers that they really want to read stories about solutions and about what communities are trying to do to address these issues. So that's something I'm interested in down the line, is looking at the research that's coming out, not just about the number of calls that are being diverted, but longer term, what impacts these programs are having on other systems like involuntary detentions, police misconduct, jailing for low-level offenses. I know that that's really complicated research, and I know some folks are working on it, and I'm excited to see what comes out in that space.
What are you actually asking with the question?
What I'm actually asking with the question is how can we use narrative to turbocharge the growing support so that alternative solutions are no longer considered alternative, but they're actually the norm?
This is such a simple, basic answer, so I apologize in advance. It's data and it's stories. That's it. That's it. You all need to get your data and your stories out as much as you can. That is what is powerful. That is what moves people. What we have learned as a news organization, and our philosophy is to marry data and storytelling. People have to trust you. That's why the data is so essential. And people have to feel you. That's where the stories come in.
Oh, go ahead.
I think what you said about marrying the data and the stories is critical, because I think there's a magic in that nexus. You can't stop doing things the old way until you build the new way. And so that combination of information really helps to make it a no-brainer, which these programs are a no-brainer. They're a win-win-win. And to be able to tell that story and back it up is really how I think we get there.
And Christy said, when you said the word solution, right? Like, I think like that's part of what's so, as we're a health policy news organization, we could cover, there are so many different topics to cover. And arguably, like, crisis response is a little bit to the side of hardcore health policy if you're thinking about drug prices and Medicare and Medicaid and things like that. But one of the reasons why it's so exciting for us to cover this as journalists is because it does feel like a solution in a way that, like, how many Medicaid solutions are there out there, right? Like, I mean, there's so many things in healthcare that are aspirational but don't have a lot of impact. This work has some real impact, and you all are sitting on a gold mine of impact. So how do you leverage that gold mine? Tahir was talking about the alchemy. You've got the goods, and now it's about investing in the communication. And the truth is, it is an investment. You have to invest in communication. Doing the work is not enough.
Yes, I agree.
Is that it?
Worthy of class. So Dan said data and stories. I'll just say, I think for those of you who are practitioners doing this work, I think we have to pursue all the available ways of doing that. So the first thing is remember that you can tell your own story. And so make sure that you're taking time to not only collect the data, but figure out how you're making that publicly available and how you're collecting stories. And so we try to make it as easy as possible for our responders to share stories that then we can put up on our website, or that we can put on our dashboard, or that I send to the manager every week, or that I'm prepared to talk about. So that's work that you can do. And it's important that you do that work because some of these other things take a long time, but they're important. And the two other things that I think are important to think about are when journalists approach you, really think about that as an opportunity. Do the kind of vetting that we talked about, but don't walk away from those opportunities. You should really consider them. Other people telling your story is very powerful. And the other thing is evaluation and research, which is a different kind of story and a different type of data, and external partnerships. And I know we have philanthropy in the room, and philanthropy has a really critical role in both of those last, because I think Dan probably got philanthropy. Our documentary was funded by philanthropy, right? So philanthropy has a really critical role in helping tell these stories and funding journalists and funding researchers. But do not forget that apart from all that, there's stuff you can do every day to tell your story, to get the data and stories out there.
Shout out to Just Trust for helping fund our work last year.
Can I say one more thing? One other thing is also that often when I've covered these stories, it's been kind of through the side door. So it's been a story that isn't explicitly about these teams, but these teams are a really relevant part of that reporting. So, for example, I did a story about, arrests within psychiatric hospitals or violence between police officers and people with dementia. And that story wasn't about an alternative response team, but I need to go talk to alternative response team members for that story to find out, how are you thinking about this? Is this something that you're seeing? And so if you start building those relationships with your local reporters, you become a person they call for any reporting they do about policing. You become a voice in these stories about these other issues that aren't exclusively about your program.
Great, thank you.